History has a grammar. It follows rules so consistent they feel mathematical, an anatomy of collapse you can trace, step by step, across centuries. Three nations that once seemed unshakable fell apart in almost the same way. First, a gulf opens between the rulers and the ruled. Then the rulers fail to fix what's broken. The middle class stops believing in the game. Institutions lose their authority. Extremists gather strength. And finally, the fragile order shatters. France, Russia, Cuba. Different maps, different languages, different decades, but the same six-stage sequence over and over, like a pattern printed into the grain of civilization. Now imagine that sequence as a blueprint, a forensic map that tells you not just how revolutions start, but how they accelerate and why they become inevitable. Imagine spotting those exact markers in your own country, in real time, not as a theory but as a checklist. Inequality widening into an obvious scandal, the halls of power answering only to money, a middle class that no longer believes reform is possible, the slow rot of courts and elections and the news that once held us together. That's not a distant prophecy. That's a diagnostic. This is the story of those six stages. It is a history of promises turned to blood and of revolutions that delivered new tyrannies where freedom had been promised. And it is the story, stark and urgent, of why the United States is no longer merely approaching this pattern. It is already inside it. If the pattern is real, then so is what comes next. Every collapsing nation leaves behind a trail of clues, not poetic ones, but measurable, repeating, almost clinical. The six-stage blueprint is not a theory invented by historians. It is a pattern extracted from the wreckage of governments that believed they were untouchable. It always begins the same way. Wealth pools at the top until it becomes a mountain casting a shadow over millions. That is stage one inequality. Not just economic but emotional. The quiet indignation of a society that feels rigged. Stage two arrives when those in power stop solving problems and start managing appearances. Corruption becomes normal, incompetence becomes expected. Governments grow bloated, unresponsive, or outright hostile to reform. Nothing changes, or worse, the changes benefit only the few. Then the hinge point, stage three. The middle class, the group that stabilizes nations, begins to crack. Rising costs, shrinking opportunities, expectations collapsing under reality. Revolutions do not erupt from the poorest. They ignite from those who thought they had a future. Stage four is where history starts to accelerate. Trust dies. Courts become political battlegrounds. Elections become disputed rituals. Media becomes noise. Institutions, the pillars that hold a nation upright, decay from symbols of order into symbols of betrayal. Stage five is when revolutionary movements stop being fringe and start becoming mass identities. Rage organizes. Desperation finds leaders. Moderates lose the ability to calm anything. And stage six is the breaking point. The old order collapses, sometimes violently, sometimes overnight, but always permanently. And when you apply the blueprint to America, the result is terrifying. Revolutions are not born from hunger alone. If they were, history would be overflowing with them. Poverty has existed in every century, in every empire, in every corner of the world. Yet, only a handful of societies ever crossed the threshold into full collapse. That's because revolutions are not triggered by how little people have, but by how much they expected to have. A rope doesn't snap from constant pressure. It snaps from the final, sudden pull that exposes how weak it had become all along. What truly destabilizes a nation is the widening gap between promise and reality. When people believe they deserve better because they were told they would have better, disappointment turns into resentment, and resentment turns into rage. In France, expectations rose faster than bread could be baked. In Russia, industrial workers expected dignity and instead received bullets. In Cuba, educated young men expected a future and were handed a dictator. It's the betrayal that breaks people, not the struggle. It's the moment they realize the system isn't failing accidentally. It's failing them. That is why revolutions erupt suddenly, violently, all at once. Not because people are starving, but because they are done waiting. 3 nations reached that breaking point. 3 nations snapped. Now, a fourth is fraying. France in 1789 was a paradox wrapped in silk. To the outside world, it was the crown jewel of Europe, elegant, cultured, the beating heart of art, philosophy, architecture, and fashion. Paris dazzled like no other city on earth. The French monarchy appeared timeless, its palaces glowing with gold, its nobility wrapped in luxury, its influence unquestioned. If you had asked anyone then which nation was most secure, most advanced, most admired, they would have said France, without a moment's hesitation. But beneath the chandeliers and marble corridors, the country was rotting, quietly, invisibly, and fatally. The inequality was not just large, it was obscene. A tiny elite floated above the nation like an untouched island. The clergy and nobility owned enormous wealth, paid little to nothing in taxes, and lived lives so detached from the public that their world may as well have been a different planet. While peasants spent 80% of their entire income just trying to buy bread, aristocrats dined in halls lit by 1,000 candles, unaware that hunger had already become a political fuse. Then came the incompetence, not dramatic, not violent, just steady, stubborn failure. King Louis XVI was not cruel, he was paralyzed. Every problem France faced, debt, famine, unrest, was met with hesitation, excuses, and half-measures. The government borrowed endlessly, cut nothing, solved nothing. Reform was discussed, debated, delayed, and then buried. The people suffered, the elites stalled, and the monarchy drifted toward disaster, convinced that its centuries of power made it safe. France was not collapsing yet, but the foundations were cracking. Cracks no one at Versailles could see. Cracks everyone in the streets could feel. The cracks were invisible until the country exploded. It wasn't the starving peasants who struck the match. It was the people who were supposed to steady the nation, the educated, the ambitious, the men who believed in laws, institutions, and order. These were lawyers, merchants, teachers, writers, the very backbone of France's rising middle class. They were not revolutionaries by nature. They were reformers. But reform only works when the system responds, and France's did not. When Louis XVI summoned the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, the moment was supposed to calm the country. Instead, it revealed the truth. The system was rigged beyond repair. One vote for the clergy, one vote for the nobility, one vote for the millions of ordinary French citizens. A 2-1 permanent defeat, locked into law. The message was unmistakable, the people could speak, but their voice would never matter. And so something ancient snapped. In a hot, cramped, indoor tennis court, ordinary men made an extraordinary choice. They declared themselves the true representatives of the nation. They vowed not to leave until France had a constitution. No weapons, no army, just resolve. That moment, the tennis court oath was the psychological breaking point, a signal that the middle class had crossed a line they could never uncross. Because when the educated stop believing in negotiation, when the moderates stop believing in patience, when the middle class stops believing in the system, the nation tips. Once the middle class turned its back on the monarchy, France didn't slide toward chaos, it sprinted. The collapse of trust hit every institution at once. The king's authority evaporated. The church lost its moral weight. The courts became irrelevant. Even the idea of France as a unified nation began to splinter. When belief dies, power dies with it. And nothing kills a government faster than the moment its people stop pretending to obey. Into that vacuum stepped the loudest voices, the angriest factions, the men who offered not balance, but certainty. The moderates tried to steer the ship, but revolutions don't reward moderation, they punish it. What rises instead are the uncompromising, the absolutists, the ones who promise purity in a world that feels contaminated. Enter Robespierre. He began as a quiet idealist, a man of principles and elegant speeches. But as France's institutions crumbled, he transformed into something else entirely, a revolutionary who believed that justice required blood. Under him, the political center collapsed. Debates turned to accusations. Accusations turned to arrests. The streets belonged not to the people, but to the mobs who believed they were the people. Violence wasn't a symptom anymore, it was a language, and everyone understood it. Once trust breaks, there is no center left to hold. The promise of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity lasted only as long as it took for the blade of the guillotine to be raised. What began as a movement for justice mutated into a machine built for fear. Paris turned into a stage where death was the daily performance, the sound of the guillotine, a rhythm the city could not escape. The very tools that were meant to defend the revolution became instruments to devour it. The king's execution was not just a punishment, it was a declaration. A monarchy that had ruled for nearly 1,000 years ended with a single, sharp fall of steel. His wife followed. His allies followed. His critics followed. Anyone who hesitated, questioned, or simply stood in the wrong crowd could find themselves accused of disloyalty. In the name of protecting the revolution, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety unleashed a purge that fed on rumor more than evidence. Equality became a slogan shouted over mass graves. Justice became a verdict delivered in minutes. Freedom became something people whispered about, not something they lived. Villages lost sons and fathers. Cities drowned in fear. The revolution didn't spiral out of control, it was driven there deliberately, fueled by paranoia and the belief that terror was the only way to preserve purity. And yet, in the end, The architects of fear were consumed by their own creation. Robespierre himself was dragged to the guillotine, condemned by the same mechanisms he had perfected. This was stage 6, the complete collapse of order, replaced not by harmony but by chaos, vengeance, and tyranny wearing the mask of virtue. The revolution promised freedom and delivered fear. Russia in 1917 looked unshakable from a distance, a vast empire stretching across continents, ruled by a dynasty that had survived wars, famines, invasions, and centuries of turmoil. Its palaces glittered like frozen monuments to permanence. Its armies were enormous. Its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, believed his power came directly from God. And yet, behind this image of strength was a nation hollowed out by the same forces that once consumed France. Inequality in Russia wasn't merely economic, it was feudal. Millions of peasants lived lives that hadn't changed since the Middle Ages. Entire families worked land they didn't own, paid rents they could never escape, and served nobles who barely acknowledged their existence. In the cities, new factory workers labored 12 or 14 hours a day for pennies, while the aristocracy danced in marble halls. It was stage 1, in its most brutal form. Then came the incompetence, staggering, deadly, undeniable. The Tsar clung to rituals and tradition while the world modernized around him. His government was corrupt, directionless, lost in a fog of privilege. When peaceful protesters marched in 1905 to ask for bread and basic rights, the imperial guards responded with gunfire. Hundreds died. That day, Bloody Sunday didn't just spill blood. It shattered the illusion that the Tsar cared for anything beyond his throne. Trust didn't erode. It vanished. And just like in France, the middle class and workers began to break. World War I pushed the nation beyond its limits. Millions of soldiers marched to the front without boots, without bullets, without hope. Entire divisions surrendered because surrender was more logical than fighting a war their leaders could not manage. A nation of millions fell in a matter of months, while Russia staggered through war, famine, and political paralysis. One man understood the pattern better than anyone, Vladimir Lenin. He recognized what most governments never do, that once institutions lose their legitimacy, power doesn't fade, it transfers. And he was ready to catch it the moment it slipped. As the provisional government struggled to control the nation after the Tsar's abdication, Lenin offered something dangerously simple: clarity. Peace, land, bread. 3 words, 3 promises. 3 solutions to the suffering that had engulfed Russia. He didn't persuade the nation with ideology, he persuaded them with relief. While moderates debated reforms, Lenin built a revolution. Factories were restless, soldiers were deserting, peasants were seizing land. Russia wasn't a nation looking for leadership, it was a nation looking for someone to end the pain. And Lenin positioned the Bolsheviks as the only group capable of doing it. In a collapsing system, the extremists always look like the ones with answers. When the institutions finally buckled, the takeover happened quickly, almost quietly. The Winter Palace fell not in a thunderous battle, but in a series of coordinated moves that lasted mere hours. The government evaporated, and the Bolsheviks stepped into the vacuum with ruthless efficiency. The shortcut to power wasn't a march. It was an opportunistic slide into a void. This was stage 4 and stage 5 unfolding in real time, the collapse of trust followed by the rise of a revolutionary movement ready to seize everything the moment the state let go. Extremists win when moderates fail. What followed Russia's revolution was not the dawn of justice that so many had imagined. It was one of the darkest descents into chaos any modern nation had ever endured. The moment the Bolsheviks seized power, the old world didn't simply disappear. It fought back. Monarchists, liberals, nationalists, foreign armies, and countless factions with their own visions for Russia collided in a civil war so vast and violent that its scars are still visible today. Villages were burned, cities starved, trains carrying food were hijacked, entire regions shifted hands multiple times in a single year. The Red Army and the White Forces weren't just battling for control, they were battling for the right to define the future itself. And caught between them were millions of civilians who had no weapons, no protection, no escape. Famine swept across the land. Disease followed. Death became a constant presence, a shadow that darkened every home. In the chaos, the Bolsheviks hardened. They built the Cheka, a secret police force that made loyalty a matter of life and suspicion a death sentence. Executions happened in basements, forests, alleys. Trials lasted minutes, if they happened at all. Fear became the new currency of order. And then, in one of the most chilling moments of stage 6, the last symbol of the old Russia was extinguished. The Romanov family, the Tsar, his wife, their children were taken into a basement and shot. Not because they posed a threat, but because revolutions erase the past to secure the future. A dynasty that had ruled for 300 years ended with gunfire echoing off cement walls. When the Civil War was finally over, Russia was not reborn into freedom. It was reshaped into something even harsher, a one-party state built on obedience, surveillance, and fear. The Iron Fist had changed hands, but it had not loosened. The revolution didn't free Russia, it replaced one iron fist with another. Cuba, in the 1000. 950 seconds was a postcard of paradise turquoise water, glittering casinos, American tourists pouring into Havana, money flowing through nightclubs and beachfront hotels. On the surface, it looked modern, prosperous, and full of possibility. But just like France and Russia before it, Cuba's beauty was only the mask. Underneath was a nation divided by a canyon of inequality and ruled by a regime that treated power as a private inheritance. Fulgencio Batista, the man who controlled Cuba, wasn't just corrupt, he industrialized corruption. Elections were meaningless, courts were performative, and police forces acted like enforcers for the wealthy. Foreign corporations bought influence by the suitcase. The elite dined in luxury while rural families lived without electricity, without schools, without hope. The island glittered for visitors, but for ordinary Cubans, opportunity was a locked door. This was stage 1 and stage 2 in their purest forms, wealth hoarded at the top, government serving itself. And then came a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. His first attempt at revolution, the Moncada barracks attack, was a humiliating failure. Most of his men were killed or captured. Castro himself was dragged into court and imprisoned. But even in defeat, something important changed. He became a symbol. His "history will absolve me" speech turned him from a rebel into a storyteller, someone who could explain Cuban suffering in a way that felt unavoidable, almost destined. When he was released and returned on the tiny yacht Granma with just 82 men, the world barely noticed. Batista certainly didn't. He thought Castro's movement would die in the mountains like every failed rebellion before it. But revolutions don't begin when the world pays attention. They begin when the world looks away. From the Sierra Maestra, Castro built an army out of peasants, students, farmers, people abandoned by the regime. Every village Batista's soldiers burned created 10 more recruits. Every beating, every disappearance, every silenced journalist strengthened the revolution's narrative. A spark in the mountains became a fire across the island. Batista's collapse didn't happen slowly, it happened all at once, like a structure that had been hollowed out for years and finally gave way under its own weight. By the late 1950 seconds, his regime had become a machine powered by fear and sustained by corruption. Torture chambers, disappearances, and rigged elections weren't secrets, they were the system. And when a government no longer hides its brutality, it signals something fatal. It believes the people are too afraid to resist. But the people were no longer afraid. Every violent crackdown backfired, turning students into rebels, rebels into martyrs, and martyrs into symbols. Castro's fighters gained ground, village by village, road by road, gathering support not because they promised ideology, but because they represented the only alternative to a regime everyone despised. Batista's military fractured, soldiers deserted, commanders fled with looted money. The state was collapsing from within. On New Year's Day, 1959, Batista fled Cuba with $300 million, no speech, no final stand, no dramatic last appeal. A dictatorship that once seemed immovable vanished overnight. Crowds poured into the streets as Castro's column entered Havana, celebrated as liberators. But revolutions don't end when the dictator falls. That's when the second transformation begins. Within months, political opponents were put on trial, trials that lasted minutes, followed by executions broadcast for the cheering crowds. Newspapers were shut down, critics were jailed, businesses were seized. The revolution that had promised democracy shifted into a one-party state with a new strongman at the center. In Cuba, corruption didn't disappear. It simply changed uniforms. Revolutions don't stop corruption, they reset who controls it. When you line France, Russia, and Cuba side by side, the similarities become impossible to ignore. 3 different cultures, 3 different eras, 3 different political systems, yet each one marched through the same 6-stage sequence as if following a script written long before their leaders were born. Stage 1. Wealth concentrated at the top. Stage 2. Governments trapped in corruption or incompetence. Stage 3. The middle class, the stabilizing force crushed until frustration turned into fury. Stage 4. Trust in institutions collapsing like a bridge with its support beams kicked out. Stage 5. Extremists stepping forward to fill the vacuum. Stage 6. The old order swept away in a tide of chaos, violence, or dictatorship. These revolutions did not erupt randomly. They unfolded predictably. France believed its thousand-year monarchy made it untouchable. Russia believed its empire was too massive to break. Cuba believed modernity and foreign money would protect it. They all believed they were exceptions. They all followed the pattern anyway. And when you map the same blueprint onto the United States today, the same inequality, the same political paralysis, the same collapse of institutional trust, the same radicalization on both sides, the parallels aren't just striking, they're alarming. Which brings us to the part no one wants to hear. The United States fits the pattern perfectly. In America today, inequality isn't a statistic, it's a landscape. You can see it from the sky. Penthouses rising above tents, private jets lifting off beside workers juggling 3 jobs, billionaires debating space travel while families debate which bill they can afford to pay this month. Wealth hasn't just concentrated, it has solidified, towering like a mountain surrounded by plains. And below that mountain, the ground is shifting. For decades, the American middle class was the stabilizing force of the nation, the proof that hard work could build a life. But now that foundation is thinning. Costs rise faster than wages. Homes drift out of reach. Healthcare bankrupts families before illness even does. Education promises a future but delivers a lifetime of debt. Every year, another piece of the American dream becomes something people talk about in past tense. This is stage 1 in motion, the quiet, widening gulf that makes societies combustible. And it leads directly into the emotional core of stage 3, expectation betrayal. Americans were raised to believe that stability was normal, growth was guaranteed, and opportunity was a birthright. When those expectations collapse, disappointment turns into something sharper. The middle class doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes paycheck by paycheck, bill by bill. In France, this was the fuel. In America, it's already burning. Trust in American government once acted like a national glue, imperfect, but strong enough to hold disagreements together. That glue is dissolving. Congress is trapped in endless gridlock, passing little, solving less, performing more. Lobbyists shape legislation behind closed doors. Corporations influence policy with checkbooks instead of votes. Agencies meant to regulate industries are run by former executives of those same industries. And the public sees all of it. What used to be called public service now feels like a marketplace where access is sold and accountability is optional. Scandals don't shock anyone anymore, they exhaust them. Corruption isn't hidden, it's normalized. Incompetence isn't denied, it's expected. This is stage 2. Not dramatic collapse, but steady erosion, the moment a government stops functioning for the people and starts functioning for itself. And ordinary Americans feel it. Every pothole not fixed, every bill not passed, every crisis met with speeches instead of solutions. People don't lose faith all at once. They lose it grain by grain, until one day they realize there's nothing left. And when citizens believe the system won't fix itself, they stop waiting. For generations, the American middle class was the engine of stability. The group that bought homes, started families, built businesses, and believed the future would be better than the past. Today, that engine is misfiring. Not because people stopped working hard, but because the math of modern life no longer adds up. A college degree was once a ladder. Now it's an anchor, dragging millions into decade-long debt before their adult lives even begin. Housing used to be the first step into adulthood. Now it's a luxury reserved for the lucky. Medical bills can destroy a family faster than illness. Groceries, rent, gas, everything rises except the paychecks meant to cover them. The middle class is squeezed from both sides, costs surging upward, opportunities slipping downward. And something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Expectations are collapsing. When a generation realizes it will not live better than the one before it, disappointment hardens into something combustible. Revolutions don't erupt from the poorest. The poor have always been poor. They erupt when the people who were promised stability begin to drown, while others watch from yachts. They erupt when teachers, nurses, engineers, small business owners, with the backbone of a nation, feel cheated by the very system they supported. A shrinking middle class doesn't just weaken an economy, it destabilizes a country. Revolutions don't start with the poor, they start with the disappointed. Institutional trust is the final pillar that holds a nation together, and in America, that pillar is cracking in real time. Elections, once a symbol of collective decision-making, are now dismissed by millions as fraud or manipulation, regardless of which side wins. Courts are viewed not as neutral arbiters, but as extensions of political tribes. The media, once a common source of truth, has fractured into echo chambers where every story has 2 versions and neither is believed universally. Even law enforcement, long seen as the backbone of order, now sits in the crossfire of public suspicion. To some, it is biased. To others, it is weak. To many, it is simply another institution that no longer represents them. And federal agencies, the FBI, the IRS, intelligence bodies are trapped in a storm of accusations, mistrust, and political weaponization. This is stage 4, the point in the revolution cycle when a country stops functioning as one nation and begins living as two or more realities occupying the same land. Facts become negotiable. Loyalty becomes conditional. Every institution becomes a battlefield. When people no longer believe in the systems that once mediated conflict, conflict moves to the streets. History shows that once trust collapses, nations don't drift back toward unity. They move forward into something more volatile. The center weakens, extremes gain gravity, and the entire political structure becomes dangerously fragile. This is the stage just before the storm. When trust collapses, people don't move toward moderation, they move toward certainty. They seek out leaders who speak in absolutes, not compromises. They gravitate toward movements that promise clarity in a world that suddenly feels illegible. And this is where stage 5 takes shape. When revolutionary ideas stop being fringe arguments on the internet and start becoming identities embraced by millions. In America, you can already see the outlines forming. On the left, there is a growing belief that capitalism itself is the enemy, that wealth must be forcibly redistributed, that the system is rotten beyond repair, that only sweeping structural upheaval can correct decades of inequality. On the right, there is rising support for strongman figures, for extraordinary powers, for breaking rules in the name of saving the nation, for the idea that democracy is too broken to protect the country's values. These are not whispers anymore. They are platforms. They are movements. They are gathering momentum. And the moderates, the people who once held the middle together, are shrinking. They're exhausted, drowned out, or simply disengaging. When the center dissolves, extremes don't balance each other. They accelerate each other. This is how stage 5 always begins. Two visions of a country, neither willing to yield. Two realities, both convinced the other is an existential threat. Two sides waiting for a spark not to protest, but to choose. The next spark won't create protests. It will create sides. Stage 6 is the destination no nation ever believes it will reach until it does. It is the point where political tension hardens into political violence, where polarization becomes fragmentation, and where the invisible lines running through a society finally tear it apart. No two countries collapse in exactly the same way, but the outcomes always rhyme. And when you examine America through the same lens that revealed France, Russia, and Cuba's fate, a set of chilling possibilities emerges. One future is a rise in organized political violence, not isolated riots, but coordinated groups acting with purpose, strategy, and the belief that force is justified. In France, it was the mobs and the guillotine committees. In Russia, it was the red and white armies battling street by street. In Cuba, firing squads became a tool of order. America has millions of armed citizens, dozens of radical factions, and a political climate already primed to justify aggression in the name of saving the country. It wouldn't take much for violence to move from spontaneous to systematic. Another future is a drift toward authoritarianism, not always through force, sometimes through exhaustion. When democracies lose their ability to function, people begin to crave efficiency. A leader who promises to clean up the mess becomes appealing. In France, that leader was Napoleon. In Russia, Stalin. In Cuba, Castro. History shows that desperation invites strongmen, and strongmen rarely leave voluntarily. A third possibility is fragmentation states ignoring federal authority, regions refusing to comply with national decisions, local governments acting as independent entities. America has flirted with this before. But in a stage 6 environment, what begins as political defiance can evolve into actual separation. Once a nation fractures psychologically, physical separation is only a matter of pressure and time. And there is the darkest possibility, a prolonged period of instability where none of these outcomes fully resolve. Supply chains breaking, markets collapsing, food shortages, foreign powers exploiting the chaos. A drawn-out struggle in which millions suffer not because one side wins, but because no side can. Every empire believes it is the exception. None ever were. History does not repeat in perfect loops, but it does echo with a force that becomes impossible to ignore. And when you listen carefully, the message is always the same. Patterns don't predict the future, they warn it. France ignored the warning signs and woke up in the terror. Russia ignored them and plunged into civil war. Cuba ignored them and traded one dictatorship for another. The United States stands at that same fork in the road, staring at the same sequence unfolding step by step. But patterns are not destiny. They are signals flashing, urgent, and unforgiving to those who pretend not to see them. America still has a choice A narrow one, perhaps, but real. Collapse is not guaranteed. Reform is not impossible. But either path demands something the nation has not shown in years: the willingness to confront the truth instead of the stories it tells itself. Inequality must be addressed before anger becomes fuel. Corruption must be rooted out before distrust becomes irreversible. The middle class must be rebuilt before disappointment metastasizes into rebellion, and institutions must regain legitimacy before they crumble completely. Because history does not punish nations for being imperfect. It punishes them for refusing to change. This moment right now is the hinge. The pivotal second between recognition and regret, between course correction and collapse, between learning from the past and repeating it. Learn the pattern. Understand the moment. Prepare for what history always brings. Subscribe because Stage 5 doesn't start suddenly. It starts silently.